Hello Internet, Nathaniel Salzman here. Welcome to the Salzmoto YouTube channel. What we have for you today is actually the video from my August 2017 presentation at Creative Mornings Chicago. The theme for Creative Mornings in the month of August was Genius. I didn't pick it, but I was asked to talk about it. Special thanks to Jen Marquez and the team at Creative Mornings for inviting me out. So what follows is that talk and the Q&A. Enjoy. Thanks, Jen. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. I am Nathaniel Salzman, and today's theme is genius. So let me start by setting the record straight that I am not a genius, or if I am, it doesn't matter. I am not successful because of that. When we say genius, we typically just mean talent or intelligence. And when we look at people who we see as geniuses, we tend to assume that their successes were born out of some inner fountain of genius that we just don't possess. And I think we let that talk us out of doing things and out of trying things. We look at someone in the prime of their career and we think we couldn't possibly do what they do. We compare our chapter 1 to their 3rd New York Times bestseller, and we give up. Or at least some people give up. I don't. Genius or talent or whatever you call it, it doesn't matter until after you've done the work. So Michael Phelps is a mutant chosen by millions of years of evolution to win gold medals in swimming. And yet all that potential didn't count for shit until he started spending 6+ hours a day in the pool and a million other units of work it took him to realize that genetic potential. So his talent, his genius for swimming is not the foundation of his success. It is the capstone. So real genius, if you ask me, is about trying things. It's not my mind, it's my mindset. It's about putting in the work. It's about attempting 1,000 different experiments and seeing where they lead you. It's about curiosity. It's digging into how things work and always trying to figure out what's going on behind the things that inspire us. And that's how I try to live. I am constantly exploring. And that's why Jen has asked me to come and talk to you today. I'm here to tell you a little bit of my story about how following my curiosity and my enthusiasm has set me on an amazing path that has brought me here to you today. So, a little bit of backstory on me. Who am I? I'm a Louisiana native. My wife and I moved here to Chicago in 2011. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in graphic design, and I've spent the past 15 years working in advertising and marketing agencies as a visual designer, a UXer, and strategist. Most recently, before I became self-employed, I was an associate experience director at Razorfish. I'm also a professional writer, journalist, photographer, drone pilot, filmmaker, entrepreneur, all the things that Jen mentioned. For the past year, I've been 100% self-employed, and I currently work about half-time doing mercenary UX work for agencies here in Chicago, and I treat that mostly like a day job. Then I spend the other half of my time scaling my company, Salzmoto. Now, Salzmoto started as a brand to showcase my work as a motorcycle builder, and then also as a venue for my writing. But my career trajectory has been defined most, I think, in my refusal to specialize. I don't want to be just a designer or just a UXer or just a writer or just a photographer. I refuse to be a T-shaped person. I want to be good at all the things. Not the best, but good. Really good, preferably. And what I've found is that getting good at something new usually isn't as difficult as I thought it was going to be. And in fact, the more things I learn how to do, the easier it gets to learn new things. So we're all familiar with this phrase, but does anybody know the back half? Humans have this remarkable ability that anything we practice, we tend to get better at. We're all probably familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's concept of the 10,000 hours. Let's run with that for a second. Say it takes me 10,000 hours to get 100% good at something. That's a huge time investment. And if we're trying to be the best in the world at something, if we're trying to be Michael Phelps, it's worth it. He definitely put in his 10,000 hours and then some. But if we apply the Pareto principle to this idea of mastery, something really interesting happens. The Pareto principle is the 80-20 rule, for those who aren't familiar with it. And that is that like 80% of our outcomes tend to come from about 20% of our inputs. And it's practically a law of nature. Like we see it everywhere. In terms of skill and mastery, coming back to that 10,000 hours, when we apply the 80-20 rule, it means that we could get to 80% mastery of pretty much anything in maybe perhaps just 2,000 hours if we focus on the right things. And Tim Ferriss has written an entire book about this, The 4-Hour Chef, which you can check out. So when we look at skill acquisition this way, it means that while Michael Phelps is over here getting 100% good at one thing, swimming, I can be over here getting 80% good at 5 things in that same amount of time. So while I still can't compete with him in the pool, perhaps he can't compete with me in the world. This applies to skills. It also applies to knowledge. If I know the critical 20% of information in a given subject area, I'm an expert. And just like mastering a skill, if I have 80% expertise in 5 things, I'm much more likely to be successful than someone who has 100% expertise in one thing. I also believe that the more diverse and unrelated those skills, the more opportunity you have to do something remarkable. And I think we're too quick to assume that 2 skills don't relate. It's actually these connection points between seemingly unrelated things where a lot of big innovation happens. Quick example, for thousands of years, we've had luggage and we've had the wheel. But it wasn't until like the 80s that anybody put wheels on luggage and the roller bag was born. In his book, How to Fail at Almost Everything and Still Win Big, Dilbert creator Scott Adams talks about skill acquisition as a way to catalyze your overall success. The more you know how to do, the more connections you make, the more things you try, the more ingredients you have with building your life. So that's all lovely in theory. Here's how it's actually played out for me in my life. These seemingly disconnected skills have been a primary driver of my success. When I was a kid of like 6 or 7, my engineer father taught me how to do basic 2D CAD work on our home computer because I wanted to draw stuff. And that led to me playing with MS Paint, and eventually I taught myself Photoshop in high school. Now, I didn't have any taste or any design knowledge, but at least I kind of knew how to use the tools. I had some skill. I started college as an engineering major, following in the old man's footsteps. I took a ton of gnarly math and science courses, including basic computer science. And I was good at most of it, but my junior year I changed to graphic design because I did not want to do math for a living. I also changed majors because I was getting paid to do freelance design work. I taught myself how to use Photoshop and some of the other digital tools, and that little bit of programming I'd taken in engineering school was just enough to where I could build websites. I still had no idea what I was doing, but my friends' parents kept hiring me to design websites and brochures for their businesses. It was fun, it was lucrative, so I went with it and I changed majors. And also, because I was a designer who could code a little bit, I had a much easier time getting my first agency jobs. And I hadn't done that on purpose. It was just, I was in the right place at the right time. Fairly early in my career as a visual designer, and again, thanks to my engineering background, I noticed that whenever I did a bit of planning and blueprinting ahead of my visual design work, I would always get better results than when I just started pushing pixels around. And only later did I realize there was a name for this, and that's user experience design. Those blueprints were wireframes, and the sitemaps I was drawing were a form of information architecture. When I made the shift to user experience in terms of a career track, 10 years into my career, my experience as a visual designer made me better at UX. And so did that tiny bit of dev work I did early in my career. My UX decisions were better because I understood what was going to happen downstream. And I understood that work because I had done it, or at least done some of it. And so looking back, I can trace this whole chain of opportunity that were unlocked for me just because I had a little bit of skill in these seemingly separate areas. And I can draw a line from MS Paint in Louisiana to Experience Director in Chicago. And that's fun. There are dozens of these types of chains in my past. And looking back, I feel like it's been my curiosity about how things work that seems to create the potential for these big outcomes further on down the road. And it's not because I'm being strategic about this stuff. It's just that the more I know how to do, the more interesting opportunities seem to find me. So another quick example, when I was a teenager, I was obsessed with aviation. And to scratch that itch, my dad and I got into radio-controlled model aircraft, which I feel like at the nerdery, like I'm in good company. It was really fun. We lived up the street from the local flying club, and it had its own little miniature runway and everything. And I was there constantly, and I got really good at it because I spent a lot of time doing it. Fast forward 20 years to a now exploding market for drones and aerial photography, and once again I find myself perfectly prepared for something that I couldn't have predicted. It took me about half an hour to get properly proficient at flying a drone. And I'm actually in the process of getting my FAA certification so I can do more of that commercially. So for me, learning how to do stuff pretty much at random has opened up all these opportunities in my life, and especially in my career. I'm willing to try stuff, and that keeps paying off for me, so I keep doing it. But one skill above all others has transformed my life and my career, and that is writing. Being a good writer is a perfect companion skill to pretty much anything. It's definitely been a huge advantage in terms of my UX practice, but it's in the same chain of opportunity sense that writing has had the biggest impact for me. I learned the basics of writing well in college, where I pursued a communications minor on top of graphic design. I didn't finish it, but I did some of that coursework. And then I started blogging back on MySpace. Yeah, MySpace. Pour one out for MySpace. That was probably around 2005. And soon I had my own site, which I still have. And I have founded or contributed to at least half a dozen other sites. So in 2007, which I can't believe that was 10 years ago, I got into scooters. This was my first bike. It's a 1979 Vespa P200, and it was a piece of shit. It was utterly terrifying. The brakes barely worked. It clunked so hard between third and fourth gear that the whole bike would lurch, and I was sure I was going to crash. I absolutely loved it, though. Not so much the bike, but the riding. And I sold that Vespa almost immediately, but replaced it with other scooters and eventually with motorcycles. And my blogging became more and more about my escapades riding around Minneapolis and St. Paul on two wheels. I'd snap photos of my day's adventure and write a little summary, and a dozen people would read it, and that was good enough for me. I started tinkering with my own bikes and doing my own repairs and modifications, and then writing about that as well. But before bikes completely took over my life, I was a car guy. And specifically, I was a huge fan of the Mini Cooper. I was super into it, and even before I owned a Mini of my own, I latched on to motoringfile.com, which is a prolific news site dedicated entirely to the Mini. I would read the latest news, I'd leave comments, I'd participate in discussions there. I eventually started submitting my own stories. And I didn't have a plan, I just jumped in and participated because I appreciated that community and I wanted to add value there in whatever way I could. In 2010, there was an open call for staff writers, and when I volunteered, the editor-in-chief didn't ask me to be a columnist. He asked me to be the managing editor, which was an amazing opportunity. He saw something in me, and apparently I'd gotten kind of good at writing, and I took that role, and we've been working together in one capacity or another ever since. Now, that little side gig as an automotive journalist made me a much better writer. It taught me how to edit other people's writing, and it taught me a standard of style and excellence. It wasn't a job. There was barely any money in it, but the perks were incredible. I got to travel all over, Los Angeles, Nashville, Austria, Germany, to various press events, usually on BMW's dime, which is a very good way to travel. On 3 occasions, I got driving lessons from a 3-time Monte Carlo rally winner, like a champion racing driver. And last year, a handful of journalists and I got a private tour of Jay Leno's garage. No. From Jay Leno. And so when I follow that chain of opportunity, I can draw a path from oversharing on MySpace to spending hours in Jay Leno's garage in Gearhead Valhalla. And it's every bit as awesome as you think, and it is 6 times bigger than you imagine. The area you see online, that's the workshop, not the garage. So my story doesn't stop there, though. Writing for Motoring File teed up several additional opportunities that I could never have planned for. In 2011, I took another writing gig, and this time it was at Blue Cat Motorcycle in St. Paul, Minnesota. Blue Cat is a vintage motorcycle repair shop, and I knew them because I had just gotten into vintage motorcycles myself, and they were where I bought all of my parts. They had a website and a blog, but they didn't have anyone who could actually create content for them. So they reached out to me because they saw on Facebook that I was an automotive journalist, and they had read some of my work. So again, there wasn't any money in it, but just like with Motoring File, the perks were amazing. I would shoot photos and write a little story for them once a week. And in return, I got parts at cost. I got access to their shop to work on my bikes. I got to basically spend a year as a mechanic's apprentice and learn how to work on bikes correctly. Twice, I got paid in motorcycles. By the end of my time there, I was occasionally even working on customer bikes right alongside their staff mechanics. So this was yet another skill for my arsenal. And all of this was in addition to my day job, which at the time was doing UX for a product development firm. So I ran that blog for a year for them. And the owner later told me that telling the story of what they were doing there in the way that I had, it effectively doubled their business the next year. And I'm still really proud of that. And I don't write content for their site anymore because of geography. That chapter of my life and my career, it closed when my wife and I were recruited to Chicago for better day jobs. I started at Razorfish in 2012. And while I was still writing for Motoring File at the time, I was on the hunt for another motorcycle-related gig like I had had at Blue Cat. And it would take me almost 2 years to find one, but find one I did. In 2013, I bought a Triumph Bonneville from Motorworks Chicago. And it's the same Bonneville that I built into the bike that I showed earlier. In the process of buying that bike, I met the owner at Motorworks Chicago, which is Johnny Sheff. And if you know the motorcycle community, Johnny's kind of a big deal. He's a true connector in the Malcolm Gladwell sense of things. We hit it off immediately. I told him a little bit about my background with bikes and with writing. And long story short, Johnny had actually been looking for a staff writer for 3 years before I turned up. And that's how Behind the Moto was born. Now, unlike the Blue Cat gig, Motorworks wanted to actually hire me, and they did. And on top of also giving me the same kind of staff perks that I had when I was in Minnesota as a volunteer. So my motorcycle habit now had corporate sponsorship. My side hustle went from being a hobby pursuit to a part-time job, and I was thrilled about this. This site launched in 2014, and today I actually help Motorworks with all of their digital marketing through Salzmoto. I help them with strategy, I write for the blog, and this year I actually started creating video content for them. And by the way, I did not know how to shoot or edit video when I started making videos for them. I just started doing it, using the camera gear I already had, and it took me about 2 weeks to learn how to create a vlog that didn't suck. I wouldn't say that I'm good at video yet, far from it, but I don't suck at it. And believe me, your videos want to suck. If you've ever tried to make video content, they want to suck. It's in their nature, and so I'm proud of that. It's yet another skill for my arsenal. So 2014 saw 2 huge turning points in my life. The first was that I turned Salzmoto from a brand into a company. And it became the business entity for my side hustle work that I do at Motorworks and also for other clients now. And over that next year, Salzmoto continued to grow as a brand, and my little company was teaching me big lessons about small business. Now, little did I know that tending this business would actually set me up perfectly for some big life events that were going to come later. I learned how to track expenses, I learned how to manage revenue, and all of my side hustle money started funneling through the company. And when that happened, another funny thing happened. Where previously my lucrative little hobby really just existed to keep me in motorcycle parts and gasoline, now I found myself using that money to reinvest in my ability to do that work. I invested in better camera gear, better tools, online courses, I bought a drone, and the company started paying my shop rent. This vision of what it would be like to work for myself started to come into focus. And through all of it, I got to learn the basics of running a small business without needing to depend on that business. So yet another skill that I can leverage. The second big thing that happened for me in 2014 is I started reading books. Lots of books. I went from reading maybe 1 book a year to reading about 60 books a year. Thanks to Audible, can't recommend them enough. Reading this much brought so much knowledge and wisdom into my life that I would then tend to redistribute that knowledge and wisdom on other people, whether they wanted me to or not. And thankfully, it's usually appreciated. Jen was actually telling me last week that this is one of the reasons she wanted me to come and talk today. So I guess I'm doing something right. So 6 months of this, and it felt like I'd done an OS upgrade on my brain. I felt like I was getting better at everything I did, and I started calling it Brain 2.0. And I still consume books like crazy today. I'm currently listening to the 36-hour Ron Chernow biography of Alexander Hamilton, and it is magnificent. It is the book that inspired Lin-Manuel Miranda to write Hamilton, and so between all the bleeding and fighting, I've been reading and writing. When I tell people about Brain 2.0, the first question is usually, how do you figure out what to read? And my reading list is driven by a very simple heuristic. I listen to the Tim Ferriss Show podcast, and when his guests mention a book as something that added to their journey, I add that book to my Audible wish list. And without a doubt, the books I've read during Brain 2.0 have added more health, more wealth, and more wisdom to my life than really anything else I can think of. They've helped me build my company, they've helped me write viral essays, and they've helped me sell my work. And so soon, my eclectic arsenal of skills and my voracious reading habit and my willingness to try things would converge to help me through a very pivotal moment in my life and in my career. In 2016, I got laid off from my day job at Razorfish. Now, I just wrapped up a huge year-long commerce project with my team, but a new project had yet to materialize for me to work on, and a couple months of that, and it was no surprise when our discipline lead called me into his office. When I saw one of our HR people sitting there, I knew what was about to happen. I wasn't scared though, and I wasn't even upset. Because of Brain 2.0, and because I'd been running my own business, I now understood how business worked well enough to understand that, especially after so many other rounds of layoffs that had happened there while I was there, this was not about me. This wasn't personal. There was no need to get upset. This wasn't me failing at my job. This was literally my job failing me because the revenue wasn't there. And by the way, knowing what is and is not about you is a superpower. Figure that out, get in the habit of asking, is this about me? And it will change your life. So the layoff wasn't about me, it was about revenue. They didn't have enough of it, and so they couldn't afford me. I literally interrupted my boss's little prepared speech, and I told him, you don't have the revenue, and I'm not on a billable project right now. I get it. How long is my severance? Thankfully, I did get some severance pay. So not only was this not about me, it wasn't an emergency. And knowing that, I started thinking about what my next move was going to be. So as I paused and took stock of my situation, being laid off my fancy day job, I realized that I hadn't lost my job. I had lost one of my jobs. And that wasn't nearly as scary. So this was my play. I used my little bit of severance as runway to do two things. The first was I built out my mercenary UX practice, and I lined up some project work. And then second, I started scaling Salzmoto, and that was a year ago. Since then, I've had steady UX project work. I've grown the Salzmoto side of the business to include 4 additional clients and several new areas of work. And it's kind of a problem, actually. I have a little bit more work than I can actually do. So if there are any motorcycle-loving creatives or other people who are good at what they do, who are looking for freelance work, please come see me after. I'm serious, I need help. So that's the journey that's brought me here to you today. And now I want to talk a little bit about why, in retrospect, all of these things worked out really well for me. And spoiler alert, it's not because I'm a genius. I think it would be easy to assume that the moral of this story is, learn skills and read books and take chances and you will win at life. I think that's true, but that's only one layer to this story. The silent supporting role in my story has been luck. And I've been incredibly lucky in my life. And this little stretch of my life story that I've shared with you is just rotten with good luck. And I've gotten so many good bounces, met so many of the right people, and been so often in the right place at the right time. I am incredibly lucky. But the thing is, we know how luck works. We've all seen this before. but I feel like I've lived it. Without meaning to, my curiosity, my skill set, all the books I read, they've been preparing me to meet these amazing opportunities. And the thing is, I don't see this as an aphorism. This is more like algebra or physics. This is an expression of how the universe works. And I think that Seneca was onto something with this. The world presents us infinite opportunities, but if we're not prepared to take advantage of them, then they're effectively locked. It's almost like they don't exist, at least for us, because we're not prepared for them. So back to our man, Michael Phelps. So his natural talent as a swimmer is not what afforded him the opportunity to compete in the Olympics. It was his preparation. He had to do a huge volume of the right kind of work in order to even qualify to try out for the US Olympic team. He did that preparation though, and it afforded him that opportunity to compete, and he was lucky enough to win over and over and over again. So for me, I try to let my curiosity run wild. I collect skills and tools and people, and I read books because I know that all of these things are preparing me for future opportunities that I can't even imagine. And by preparing myself, I unlock opportunity and I create my own luck. And the best part is you can do the same thing, and you don't have to be a genius. Thank you. So now we have mandatory Q&A. How can I help? In the back.
What does your typical day look like when you wake up to
Today?
Yeah.
So he's asking what my sort of typical day is like. My typical day, I work from home most days. And again, I do a lot of agency project work. I try to do that about half time. And so if I don't need to go to my actual agency's office to do that work, I get up probably around 9 o'clock and I work on whatever I need to work on there. And to understand how a typical day works for me, I have to go into how a typical week works for me. I start my week planning out the things that need to get accomplished that week. And I try to time block as much of that as I can into my calendar. I try to identify the mandatories, the things that I have to do, and then schedule around that. And then for any given day, it's really just looking at what am I trying to get done today and trying to prioritize my most profitable work first and trying to let non-essential things truly slide. So yeah, it's not super glamorous necessarily, but the thing that I like most about the way that I work is I have an immense amount of control over my time. And so if I want to get up at 10 o'clock in the morning and work until 8 o'clock at night, I can do that. But no 2 days are typically the same for me. I do try to have as much routine as I can, but lately, especially with a lot of things that have been going on with me, I've not been able to do that. Yeah?
What would you, at the time think of them, the 3 most influential books that you've read in this time?
Sure. The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. I read that book right before taking on a super gnarly project, and I succeeded only because I had read that book ahead of time. The sort of spiritual sequel to that book is Ego is the Enemy, also by Ryan Holiday. I read that book right before I got laid off. And that was, again, perfect timing. Third book for me would be Anti-Fragile by Nicholas Taleb. It's part of a whole series on a very different way of thinking. I don't agree with him on everything, but when I did decide to, when I got laid off, when I decided not to just pursue another day job, part of that was because of, he gives an example in his book about 2 brothers, one who's a cab driver and one who's like a corporate type guy. And the cab driver has a lot of volatility in his work. So he has ups and downs, he can be busy, he can be slow. If you map his like revenue, it's all over the place. Whereas the brother who works like the corporate job, his stuff is really stable, it's really flat, it's really easy to expect. He knows how much his paychecks are gonna be and when they're gonna show up. But in the story, because the cab driver is like taking his volatility all the time, he's pretty well insulated from like some big disruptive event, you know, short of like Uber and Lyft. But any sort of singular event, like totally disrupting the way that he earns his living. Whereas like the steady guy can get laid off, and it is actually a big deal for him. And so What I wanted to experiment with in becoming self-employed was to embrace that volatility, because supposedly the trade-off is greater long-term stability. And so far that's working out for me. There are 3 people that have a nice sort of chain of connection for me. Those are Adam Savage, Tom Sachs, and Casey Neistat. And the only reason I know about Tom Sachs is because of Adam Savage. The only reason I know about Casey Neistat is because of Tom Sachs. Adam is the quintessential jack of all trades. The reason that he was able to do what he did on Mythbusters is because he already knew how to build stuff. And he already was interested in storytelling, and he was already like dying to be in front of the camera. Tom Sachs is a sculptor who works mostly in bricolage, found stuff, plywood, fiberglass, things like that. And his art is amazing because it's kind of grounded in his desire to build the things that he doesn't have. And that is included an entire NASA space program, which has a whole performance art thing. Like his stuff is absolutely amazing and inspiring. And the only person he follows on YouTube is Casey Neistat, who, as a filmmaker, as a creator, as a human being, as a workaholic, there's so many things to admire about that guy and his hustle. So those are my 3 in 1. Yes?
So you talked about your refusal to specialize and...
I'm sorry, to repeat his question. He's being told to become a T-shaped person, and I think that's a terrible idea. The typical T-shaped person is to be shallow in a wide range of areas, have a wide range of interest, which basically just boils down to be sort of aware of the world around you. That's not good enough. And then you go deep in one area of expertise. Now the problem is, it gets us into that 100% versus 80-20 type situation, is that when you go super deep in just one area of expertise, you do at some point, you pass a point of like sort of usefulness, where like, okay, here's the point at which I know everything I know to be very effective in my job, outside of related skills like soft skills and presentation skills and the other things that have nothing to do with your actual area of expertise unless you're a professional speaker. There's a point at which continuing to dive deep into that doesn't actually make you effectively any better at your job. And all it does is tend to anchor you deeper and deeper into that thing, so that is now the only thing you're qualified to do. And in especially like kind of today's market and all the volatility that there is in culture and everything else, I think that's actually a risky proposition to put all of your eggs in that one basket. And so understanding that expertise and being a very skilled person in a lot of different areas is not as difficult as we assume it is. The metaphor I like to use is to become a bridge-shaped person. So instead of drilling deep into like a single area of expertise, it's to stand up pylons of expertise and make connections between those, because therein you create a lot of your own luck, coming back to some of the other things I was talking about. So yes, you do have to reach a certain level of proficiency, and especially if you're early in your career and you're trying to get started in design or in whatever, you are gonna need to focus and build that expertise. But my recommendation would be, do it Tim Ferriss style. Do the analysis, figure out what 20% of skills and knowledge in that subject area are the critical ones, get super good at that, and then branch out. Anybody else? The thing that I found is the most effective is to get to work. Casey Neistat, in one of his videos, has this great metaphor that he uses where he says, for me, motivation is not a problem, because there's where I am and there is where I want to be. And all that is between these two things is a bunch of work. And I believe that wholeheartedly. And for me, I find when I'm lacking motivation or when I'm stuck, it's because I've lost sight of where I'm trying to go. So it was very important to me, and I hopefully I've succeeded in this, it was very important to me that this talk not suck. And I've been working on this since like November, maybe, but it didn't really materialize until Tuesday. And I'm having a very, very busy week, and I needed to spend time on this, but I had other things that needed to happen as well. I had a group of wireframes I needed to do. And so like it was not, in order for me to work on this and have time to work on this, it was not an option for me to be stuck when I was working on those wireframes. So knowing where you're trying to go and like making sure that you actually want to go there and letting that be the sort of fount of your motivation is very powerful. Yeah. There at the back. So I always have so many irons in the fire that there's always something for me to switch to. And I have only lately become more strategic about the things that I want to learn. But for the most part, like for what brought me here, it's just been following my enthusiasm. It's like I'm kind of a hoarder, but of ideas and skills instead of garbage. And that just it makes me more acceptable to society, but it's probably no less pathological. You had a question.
Yeah, when you are learning a new skill, do you immerse yourself in that to get that knowledge? Is that how you learn that skill?
Usually, I pick up skills as part of doing a particular project. So I like to build stuff in my workshop, and one of the things that I'm slowly working on is I want to do a replica of Thor's hammer from the movies of Mjolnir, but I want to build it out of steel. And so in order to do that, I'm going to have to learn how to engrave. I'm going to have to learn how to be a better welder than I currently am. I'm going to have to learn how to build a jig to hold that in place as I weld that box together so that it doesn't warp. I'm going to have to learn more about leather work than I already know. I'm going to have to learn how to stamp aluminum. I'm going to have to learn how to do molding and casting. And so like, I don't know how to do any of that shit. But that project affords me the opportunity to try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and try to fail. And that right there is, I think, also a super important concept that anything new that you're trying to do, again, coming back to mind versus mindset, be willing to do it 5 times. Like your first grilled cheese sandwich is always terrible. Your first pancake is always bad. Your first attempt at doing anything new is going to be terrible. Keep going. Do the same thing over and over and over again. So I will probably end up building 3 or 4 of those hammers, or at least pieces. Like I'll build the handle 3 or 4 times. I'll build the box probably 3 or 4 times before I get enough pieces that I'm happy with. And I just know that's going to happen. I'm just going to go ahead and buy that much material, set aside that much time, and be willing to iterate and iterate and iterate and iterate. But in terms of any sort of really intentional way by which I would go about learning a skill, it's just to get in there and start doing it and learn it on the job, so to speak. Yeah. Okay, this last one, you better make it count.
Okay. So back when you were working full time, and then you also had side businesses, and you were learning all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
It sounds like that's a lot of work, a lot of time in your day to day. I'm wondering, like, what things that normal people do were you giving up during that time, or what were you sacrificing?
The simple answer to that question is that I read Tim Ferriss's The 4-Hour Workweek, and I figured out how to do my day job in less time. And I figured out how to also do these other things that I was pursuing as effectively and as efficiently as I could. And so, yeah, Brene Brown wrote an amazing book on creativity called Big Magic, and everyone in here should read it twice. And she talks about how for your art, for the thing that you really want to do, it should be like your mistress. You should be stealing time away from your primary commitments as much as you can get away with in order to, sneak into the stairwell and make out with the thing that you really want to be doing. So that's the best advice I would have for you on that. Thank you. So there you have it. Thank you so much for watching. Thanks again to Jen Marquez and the crew at Creative Mornings. If you're not familiar with Creative Mornings, I've linked their site below in the description. Definitely go check it out. It's a great place to get inspired and to meet other creative people in your city. If you want to connect with me on social media or otherwise, those links are below in the description as well. Please reach out and say hello. If you want more content like this, go ahead and subscribe. If you liked this, please go ahead and share it with your friends. If you didn't like it, please share it with your enemies. Have a great day, and remember, if it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing.